Nightcast. Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth brings you the current news from the world today and how it relates to Bible prophecy. Understanding the end-time events leading to the peaceful world tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth.
Good evening, friends, and welcome to this July 7, 2014 edition of Nightcast. Our opening story tonight, the Palestinian Islamist movement Hamas has fired a volley of rockets into southern Israel following a series of airstrikes by Israeli forces. Hamas said it was responding to Zionist aggression after accusing Israel of killing 5 of its fighters. With this opening story tonight, we go to James Reynolds.
Overnight, Israel's Air Force struck targets in Gaza, the piece of land ruled by the Palestinian armed movement Hamas. Israel says it went after rocket launcher sites and warehouses. Israel's airstrikes killed a number of armed men from Hamas and other groups. This was the deadliest attack on Gaza since 2012. This morning, a rocket fired by Hamas landed in the Israeli village of Nirim, next to Gaza. In recent days, Hamas has fired several dozen of its own crudely made rockets across the border.
We are acting to protect our people. We are targeting the terrorists in Gaza, those firing the rockets, and Hamas has to understand, this must stop.
Israel's strikes on Gaza have prompted Hamas to promise further attacks of its own.
Fighting between Israel and Hamas in Gaza has been a regular part of this conflict. But what may worry Israel more is the atmosphere here in Jerusalem and in nearby areas. Palestinians who live under Israeli rule have protested and they've fought against the police.
This morning, the chief Palestinian negotiator, Saeb Erekat, took diplomats to see the village of Nabi Samuel. It's surrounded by Jewish settlements built on land the Palestinians want for a state.
What we're witnessing of this wave of escalation is a systematic approach by the Israeli government to throw us in the path of bloodshed, violence, counter-violence, chaos, which we have seen in 2002.
In the north of Israel, Arabs who have Israeli citizenship have clashed with the police. These protests are more unusual. They're a sign of increasing anger in this conflict. James Reynolds, BBC News, Jerusalem.
Okay, thank you very much, James. And I have some notes also from James Reynolds here. Hamas said it was responding to Zionist aggression. I mentioned that at the opening, after accusing Israel of killing 5 of its fighters. Israel denied killing the men, but warned of a deterioration and said 1,500 reservists have been called up. Tension has spiked in recent days over the murders of 3 young Israelis and a Palestinian teenager. The Israeli military said that just in 1 hour today, Monday, 40 rockets had been launched from the Gaza Strip. 7 rockets were intercepted over the southern city of Ashdod, and 5 rockets were intercepted over Netivot, Netivot, an army statement said, according to the AFP news agency. Rocket alarm sirens were heard in the Haf Ashkelon, and in another city. Now, we have another video from Israel. Funerals were held in a refugee camp for 2 of the militants killed overnight. Israeli airstrikes on Gaza kill 9 Palestinian militants. Let's go for that story. Oh, friends, all right, I apologize. This story is not a video. I just have a still for this, and I'll have to read you some notes we have on this. The armed wing of the Palestinian militant group Hamas said 6 of its fighters died in a single strike near Rafah in the south. 3 others died in separate Israeli airstrikes in response to at least 20 rocket attacks from Gaza. Tensions in the region are high following the murder of Palestinian teenager Mohammed Abu Khdair. And let's see, we had that one report for you. Visitors pay respects at Khdair mourning. Let's see, in a tent they've set up, a mourning tent they've set up over there. Attempts are being made to clear up the East Jerusalem neighborhood close to the family home of Mohammed Abu Khdair. That's the Palestinian teenager who was murdered last week. People have continued to visit a mourning tent near Mohammed Abu Khdair's house. A post-mortem examination suggests he was burnt alive. Anger over his death, which is believed to be a revenge attack for the earlier murders of 3 Israeli teenagers in the West Bank, has fueled 5 nights of violence in Arab areas of Jerusalem and Arab Israeli towns and cities. 6 Jewish Israeli suspects have been arrested. And I may have a couple more videos for you, friends. Let's take a look and see here. I believe this may be James Reynolds again with an update.
Overnight, Israel's Air Force struck targets in Gaza, the piece of land ruled by the Palestinian armed movement Hamas. Israel says it went after rocket launcher sites and warehouses. Israel's airstrikes killed a number of armed men from Hamas and other groups. This was the deadliest attack on Gaza since 2012. This morning, a rocket fired by Hamas landed in the Israeli village of Nirim, next to Gaza. In recent days, Hamas has fired several dozen of its own crudely made rockets across the border.
We are acting to protect our people. We are targeting the terrorists in Gaza, those firing the rockets, and Hamas has to understand, this must stop.
Israel's strikes on Gaza have prompted Hamas to promise further attacks of its own.
Fighting between Israel and Hamas in Gaza has been a regular part of this conflict. But what may worry Israel more is the atmosphere here in Jerusalem and in nearby areas. Palestinians who live under Israeli rule have protested and they've fought against the police.
This morning, the chief Palestinian negotiator, Saeb Erekat, took diplomats to see the village of Nabi Samuel. It's surrounded by Jewish settlements built on land the Palestinians want for a state.
What we're witnessing of this wave of escalation is a systematic approach by the Israeli government to throw us in the path of bloodshed, violence, counter-violence, chaos, which we have seen in 2002.
In the north of Israel, Arabs who have Israeli citizenship have clashed with the police. These protests are more unusual. They're a sign of increasing anger in this conflict. James Reynolds, BBC News, Jerusalem.
And friends, I believe we'd have next a video from Yolande Nell reporting about the visitors paying their respects at the Khdair mourning tent in Jerusalem.
Visitors are continuing to come to the mourning tent for Mohammed Abu Khdair, the 16-year-old Palestinian teenager who was murdered last week. This morning, his father has had Palestinian officials here and also some sympathetic ultra-Orthodox Jews who've come to pay their respects. If we continue up, though, to the family house, there's a huge banner of Mohammed that's outside, and this declares him to be a shaheed, a martyr. But just look over here to the road where clashes have been going on a nightly basis since he was killed. Bit of an attempt now to clean it up, to repair the Israeli tram system that runs through the Shufat neighborhood. But you can see there are other burnt out buildings around, still a bit of glass and some rocks on the floor where Palestinian protesters and Israeli police have been caught up in these clashes. But it's not just been here in Shufat, it's been in other East Jerusalem neighborhoods, in Arab Israeli towns and cities, in the south and the north of Israel, as well as the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, that there's been a lot of violence. And that's all leading to increased concern that this could all spiral out of control.
Okay, thank you very much, Yolande. And friends, we've covered stories tonight so far that relate to the second seal of Revelation, and that's depicted in the book of Revelation by, you see 2 columns over where we've got the red bar. That's to tell you, remind you that Revelation depicts this second seal as a red horse, which Jesus Christ described, and the gospel writers wrote up what Jesus Christ described in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. Those are all the parallel chapters on the Olivet prophecy, and the Olivet prophecy, as it's called, of Jesus Christ, answers the question the disciples ask him, what would be the sign of your return and of the end of this world? The word for world being aeon, meaning age or society, not the blowing up of the earth, but just the end of the culture, the society, the system as we know it on this earth at this present time, while Lucifer, who became the arch adversary of our Creator, and now the arch adversary of all of us who are made in the image of our Creator, in other words, the enemy of all mankind, was renamed as that old serpent, that dragon, that old dragon of old, Satan the devil. And he's called the God of this world because before man was created, that being who was the beautiful archangel Lucifer, the dawn of the morning, his name means, the bringer of light, the angel that God created with a mastery of making of music. And a lot of the music we have now that has such wonderful tunes to it is by inspiration of the God of this world to the minds of men. And yet sometimes they put some pretty perverse lyrics along with those beautiful, beautiful words, either perverse or pagan, or lyrics that are in worship of the devil. When you understand what the devil stands for, you know, he's known as the sun god of Baal, and worship of the sun and the sun god Baal is what Constantine was doing when it seemed at first in the Roman Empire, after persecution of any and all Christians by the former emperors in Rome, it seemed like a great relief when Constantine issued the Nicene Creed, and that came a little later. Some of the first issuances he made that sounded like he was going to be in favor of all Christendom. But then come to find out he's only in favor of the Christendom that adopted the old pagan Baal worship beliefs, worship of the sun. And Constantine was a worshiper of the sun. He believed that the sun, the god of the sun, guided him in his battles. And then when the Roman Catholic religion buddied up to him, and they buddied up with the old pagan worship of the sun god Baal and all of the peripheries of that, why, when they came along with willing to worship the sun god and tie Christianity into it, why, Constantine saw that as an answer to resolving some of the conflicts he was having with both false and true Christians, those who were keeping the Sabbath and those who were willing to worship the sun god Baal. You know, and eventually Constantine went along and especially those after Constantine, went along with the Roman Catholic Church in issuing in the Council of Council of the Laodicean Council in 365 AD. Now that'd be a little bit after Constantine's time, but the emperors who followed Constantine saw that he was having some success with creating some kind of peace, at least halfway, because there were about as many people as late as 300 AD and a little after. There were about as many people God had been either calling or on their own, one way or the other, keeping the Sabbath and trying to be true to God, even to the point of willingness to be a martyr and being put to death in horrifying circus-like situations in the Roman cathedral. What do they call those things? The big Roman open, coliseums, where they would make a game of feeding the lions by Christians, faithful Christians who wouldn't bow down to the image of the beast and worship the divinity of the Roman emperors, which the Baal-worshipping Catholics were willing to do. They would worship the Baal god, and they would also worship the emperor. Hey, no problem to them, because worshiping Baal was like worshiping the emperor. I mean, they all part and party of the same thing. Now, there may have been a few who understood they should not be worshiping the emperor, who through some kind of ignorance were worshiping Baal, and they got thrown in the lion too. Anybody that wouldn't bow down and worship the emperors as a god could be subject to being thrown into that Colosseum in their games of having to sport against wild, unfed animals. They would not feed them for a long time, so the animals were starving, hungry, and then let them loose in the Colosseum, where there's a few human beings that they've got chained up out there, and those lions would go for them, while the audience of Romans would cheer. And that was the kind of martyrdom going on in the early Roman Empire. Now, people thought Constantine was a great guy when he acknowledged Christianity, so-called Christianity, the Baal-worshipping kind of Christianity, the Baal-worshipping kind that the Catholic Church was happy in full-page advertisements or announcements in the New York Times to kind of thumb their nose at the Protestants and say, look, you're keeping Sunday means you're one of our daughters. You're following us, because you will not find anywhere in the pages of the Bible anything that does away with a Saturday Sabbath and that sets up, people stretch it. Protestants have found this scripture and that scripture, which they take out of context and stretch the blooming blazes out of it. But the Catholics who created Sunday worship, they're thumbing their nose at the Protestants who do that. They say, it ain't in the Bible. These are the Catholics telling you this and saying, you got that from us. We Catholics are the ones who established and created and set up this Sunday thing. And way back in 365 AD, at the Council of Nicaea, Council of Laodicea, Council of Nicaea was earlier in 321. That's where the Nicene Creed was first written, adopted, formulated, with Constantine involved and a bunch of bishops over in Nicaea. And, they all buddied up together, and hunky-dory, there we go with the woman beginning. She's starting to put a saddle on the beast now. She's about to ride the beast of the Roman Empire. And, oh boy, she gets that saddle well made and hewn and strapped up on that beast. And she's able to get up on that beast now and in the saddle, takes the reins and guides that beast where she wants him to go. Now, there have been some fallout, and there has been some fighting. There's even been some fighting between the Eastern Constantinople division and the Western Rome division of the empire, of the Roman Empire, the civil side of it. And that's why, but in the prophecy in Daniel 2, that's why the statue, when we get down to what it represents, now I've got that statue on part of my just overall, let me bring the whole thing before you up close. On the left side of my chart, the very left side, I've got the image that Daniel saw in his dream, or Nebuchadnezzar saw it first, and he was going to make his magicians. He wanted to know what that dream meant, but before he would believe any of his own magicians, he said, I'm not going to tell you what the dream was, and then you just tell me anything in the blue blazing world you want to tell me it means. To know that this dream is, that you've got the inspired answer to this dream, you've got to tell me what the dream was as well. None of his magicians could do that. He was about to put them all to death, including his own wise men, who included Daniel and his three buddies, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who Nebuchadnezzar had drafted as young men from the tribe of Judah that had been taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar. But one of the aides of the king had talked to Daniel and said, Daniel, I'm sorry, I like you, but he's going to have me, the executioner, he's going to have me cut off the heads of all of you guys, because nobody's been able to tell the king what the dream was and what the meaning of the dream was. Daniel pleaded for some time and said, go tell the king that the God in heaven will give me the answer for him. So the executioner speaks to the king. The king says, well, bring me this Daniel before me. And when Daniel, let me come back out here for a moment, friends. When Daniel goes before the king Nebuchadnezzar, the king says, well, I understand you can tell me what my dream was and what the dream means. And Daniel wisely and with humility answered the king, O king, not me, but there is a God in heaven who rules in the hearts of men and on this earth, who rules from the heaven, who has given me the dream you had and its meaning. Oh boy, now with those words, King Nebuchadnezzar is on the edge of his seat. Daniel's got him in the palm of his hand now. The king is like, nothing else around me matters. What was my dream? And more importantly, once you've established that you've got some kind of inside with this great God you're speaking of, who gave you my dream, which that tells me you ain't just guessing and making up stuff here. If you can tell me that dream and I haven't revealed it to anyone, if you can tell me what I dreamed, and then I'm going to believe that your God who gave you what he put in my mind as a dream inspires your words to tell me what the dream was. And so Daniel, now let's bring that chart back out. Daniel proceeds to tell the king that you saw this great image that had, I wish I had the color version up here, friends. I have this in color also, but I grayed out the parts on the side because for most of our broadcast, we mainly focus on the parts you see in the middle in color that are the seals of Revelation. But over on the left side, in spite of the fact I've got them black and white in this particular slide, at the very top, if you look closely there, you can see that there's a head of a statue there. And in the full color version, that's gold. It's a golden color. This head of gold, King Nebuchadnezzar, is you. You as the ruler of a world empire, a great world empire of the highest level and quality. After you will be a slightly inferior world ruling empire that the silver arms and breast represent, and who that would be. And then on down the line, the stomach and the thighs of brass, and then down at the bottom, and this part is in color, the two legs that you see, those two legs, which culminate in 2 feet with 10 toes, 5 on each foot, of course, normal, as normal, but that has a meaning in the dream. Those two legs also have a meaning. They mean an east and west division of the Roman Empire. Now, friends, there are a lot of people who understand that image. Commentaries were able to understand what Daniel was saying there. And easy for Mr. Armstrong to pick that up and verify it and see how history and the Bible and these things relate. But what Daniel couldn't even understand who these would be, because they were after he lived, and when we get down to where we are today in these last days, Daniel would have given his left tule, whatever that might be, his whole life he would have given early to have known, God, what in the last days, what does all this mean? Well, God said, look, this is sealed until the end. So go your way, Daniel, and even if God could have told Daniel, what God couldn't tell Daniel was who would be these heads in the last days. Because, for example, like on the right side of this chart, where we've got the kings of Revelation 17 that are mentioned, it says there are 7 kings. And I'm talking about the very far right side of this chart. There are 7 kings. Just a minute, though. I want to come back to the left side. I do have a color chart. You see the head of gold, then the arms and breast of silver, and then the belly and thighs of brass, and then the legs of iron. We've got that on the chart under Daniel 2. Now, coming back over here on the right side of this chart, and friends, I do have close-ups of the right side of this chart. I've got to get my camera shots lined up where I can just punch a button where they come right up here. Well, I can focus in like this on the right side. Somewhere, I think I'm supposed to have a blow-up of that. All right, I got a little more work to do to get my camera shots lined up where I can show this to you the way I would like to show it to you, friends, but just so that your focus is on the right side of this chart for the moment. I've got this chart divided so that at the first bar, if you count the pictures, 1, 2, 3, 4, on the right side, there's 5. Those are the 5 kings that are fallen that Revelation 17 verse 10 mentions. 5 of the 7 kings are fallen. Now, there's no way that God could have told Daniel who these people would be, even if God would have known their names in advance. And just like, well, I can't think of the word at the moment that I would like to use, but let me come back out just for a moment. We'll go back to that chart. Even if God were to have known the names of who the kings would have been when they came along, since about 500 A.D., I'm just giving you a general figure so you can relate backward in time. Actually, it was around 554 A.D. when Justinian restored the imperial condition, the east and west of the Roman Empire that had divided up Constantinople and Rome. Constantinople in the east, Rome in the west. That was 554, and Justinian is recognized not only by us, but by many commentary writers as the first king of these 7 heads. And then the next head, let's see. I wish I could enlarge this for you. Let's see if I can bring that back out to this. The next king was Charlemagne, who was crowned by the Pope in 800. He was the second king of these 5 that are fallen, and then the third king was Charles V, and then the 4th king was, I skipped one there. Who did I skip? Otto the Great. Otto the Great was the 3rd king of the Ottoman Empire when the Arabs kind of ran in and took over Europe for a while. And then following that, Charles V was the great warrior ruler. And then the fifth of those 5 kings that are fallen was Napoleon. And then when Napoleon fell, the Roman Empire went into the abyss, or let's say the pit, for a while, and wasn't restored. That goes back to 1804, and then for over 100 years, the Roman Empire stayed in the abyss until, and between the 2 bars there where it says 5 are fallen and 1 is, in 1936, when Mussolini invaded Ethiopia and made the bold claim he had restored the Holy Roman Empire. At that point in time, that part of Revelation 17:10, which had been written in a future present tense by John way back in 70 AD, 70, 80, 90 AD, John had written in the future present tense saying 1 is. Now, Mussolini wasn't even alive when John wrote that way back before 100 AD, and yet he wrote in the future present tense saying 1 is. Now that verse, Revelation 17:10, that part of the verse did not become active in the present tense, no longer the future present tense, but the very perfect present tense until 1936, at which time, that was a time when Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong was alive, and in fact, he was 43 or 44 years old, depending on what part of the year that happened. If it happened before July, he was 43. After July of 1936, Mr. Armstrong would have been 44. And Mr. Armstrong had been, at that point, active in God's work for 10 years. God first beginning to call him in 1926. And after Mr. Armstrong proved the Bible, proved that we should keep not only the weekly Sabbath, but the annual Sabbath. And he tried to tell those from whom his wife learned about the Sabbath, and then he, through his wife, and in meeting with those people, he tried to tell them that, look, you're right about the weekly Sabbath, but it goes, Colossians 2:17 goes beyond establishing that the weekly Sabbath should be kept. Some people try to misuse Colossians 2:16 to say, see, that does away with the Sabbath. But when you look up the original Greek word, as God inspired Mrs. Loma Armstrong to tell Mr. Armstrong, when Mr. Armstrong came home from the library one day and say he found this article written by a former Seventh-day Adventist, who is now a dissident Seventh-day Adventist, that said this verse proves that the Sabbath is done away. Oh, Mrs. Loma D. Armstrong stayed up all night that night, crying and praying and probably sweating big tears, pleading with God to help her husband and have an answer for her husband as to why Colossians 2:16 would not do away with the Sabbath. And God gave her the answer in the morning, just before her husband got up. And when he got up, she said to him, Mr. Armstrong, Herbert, oh, dear, I want you to go to the library again today, one more day. Spend the day there like you've been doing. But while you're there today, and this is what God put in her mind, after she prayed all night long from her heart, God gave her the answer in the morning. She didn't give up. She stayed with that vigilantly in prayer all night. And in the morning, just before Mr. Armstrong woke up, God put it in her head to encourage your husband, go to the library today, as you've been doing, and look up the original Greek word, the key word in Colossians 2:16. Look it up in the Greek language, in the lexicons they'll have and did have in that, I believe it was the Portland, Oregon library, I think is where he was going at that time. look up that original Greek word, honey, Mrs. Armstrong said to her husband, and then come back and I don't know exactly how she said it, but come back and whatever you find, well, we'll tell me about it. But Colossians 2:16 says, "Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of a holy day, or of the new moon, or of the Sabbath days." And Mr. Armstrong, when he looked up the original Greek, he saw, and from other places in the Bible, he saw that if Colossians does away with the weekly Sabbath, it also does away with the other. Well, after he looked up the original Greek word, he came back, and I got a lot of notes in here, friends, but let me just get the cut and chase, because we got some more video I want to show you tonight. Important news stories. Mr. Armstrong came back and said, "Well, honey, what I found was that original Greek word establishes and proves that not only is the weekly Sabbath not done away with, but that we are also still required, commanded by God even, to keep the annual Sabbaths as well." And his wife was so elated by the one thing that she willingly and understood what her husband was saying and said, "Okay, dear, let's do as we should. Let's keep the weekly and the annual Sabbaths too." And for the next 7 years, Mrs. Armstrong kept the annual Sabbaths, 7 of them there are, with her husband. There's 7 festivals, and there are also 7 annual holy days. Now, those don't exactly mesh, because one of the festivals is not a holy day, that being the Passover, but it is a festival of God. It's shown as a festival of God, listed in Leviticus 23. But the point here is Mrs. Armstrong kept the annual holy days with her husband for the next 7 years. Now, they didn't stop after 7 years, but for the next 7 years, they kept them without understanding the meaning behind those holy days. I've mentioned that here before. And then God opened up the understanding to what those days mean. And the rest of us who God called to be part of the spring harvest, that's not everybody. And I know there are some of you who watch this program for news related to the Bible who are not called to the spring harvest. And that's fine. That's not my doing. It's not my prerogative to call you or give you a calling. I think I do. I'm seeing where I do have a responsibility in this program God's given me to do with the small audience I have that is sometimes a rotating audience, but to use this open door as to put forth a warning. And some of you will heed it and be blessed by heeding it, because God says there's 2 chapters in which he specifically has put blessings and cursings that are related to where he says, if you obey me, here are the blessings I'll give you. Wonderful blessings. But on the other hand, if you do not obey me, the great God, if you don't obey God, then just the opposite of the blessings, here are the cursings you will receive. And they're, in many cases, just the opposite of what the blessings were. For example, somewhere for an individual, he'll bless you with rain right in your backyard where your fruit trees grow. But then others apply collectively to the individuals of a nation, saying that if the majority of you are obeying me, your nation will be the head, not the tail. Your nation will be a borrower. I got that backward, because the United States right now has got it backwards. Your nation will be a lender, not a borrower. Now that's, and there's more. One of you, 5 of you will chase 100, 100 of you will chase 10,000. You won't have to worry about your enemies. I'll fight these battles for you. I'll put fear into the hearts of your enemies. But on the other hand, just the opposite of all those things. If you don't obey me, you'll be the tail, not the head. And as the United States is finding itself with less and less pride of power, afraid to use the power we still have in large part, the 19th verse of Leviticus 26 is coming true, where God says, if you don't obey me, ultimately here I will break the pride of your power, which is happening to the United States. And UK don't laugh, because it's happening to you too, who at one time were Great Britain, ruling over so many countries and conglomerate of nations that the sun, it was said of Great Britain, the sun doesn't set, never sets on Great Britain. Not true anymore. So you guys don't laugh, Ephraim, because of Manasseh's falling from its great pride now, and still has its money as the reserve capital of the world, and also the petrocurrency. But that's very soon about to change. There are competing currencies that are being stacked up by China and Japan and other nations that will allow them to start switching over their reserve from the dollar to the euro, to the yen. And Russia and China are already making an agreement to trade outside the dollar. And Russia's ruble will be able to go up in value as a result of that. But let's go on, friends. I'm just hitting the tip of the iceberg on that. I wanted to mention this to you. Let me bring this out for a moment. Our first couple of stories related to the second seal, that Jesus Christ described as war and rumors of war, a red horse and war, rumors of war, and world war. And we're going to go next to a story related to the white horse, which is, Christ said in plain language, don't let anybody deceive you. There will be many who will come in my name, saying that I am the Christ, Jesus Christ is the Christ, but deceiving many by using Christ's name and doing a message about Christ, but not bringing the message that Christ himself brought about the kingdom of God that will come. And in answer to the disciples' question, what will be the sign of your return and of the end of this society, the governments of man, and you're restoring the kingdom of God here? That was their question, and Christ answered it by saying, when you see these events happening that he described in the Olivet prophecy, which Revelation 6 depicts here with these seals, deception, war, famine, and the fourth seal, which is depicted as a pale horse with a rider whose name is Death. And Jesus Christ described, I've gone over this before, but I'll mention it real quickly again, the activities of this horse as the gospel writers recorded it were loimos, disease epidemics, pestilence, the plagues of Egypt. Christ also mentioned seismas, commotions in the air, gale force winds of all kind, commotions on the ground such as earthquakes and tsunamis and volcanic eruptions and anything that makes a big commotion on the ground, even floodings from the rain in the air. And he also mentioned in that was recorded in Mark 13, verse 8 by Mark, Terak, a trouble that will lead to the mega trouble, the next seal, fifth seal, the mega trouble, the great tribulation. Not here yet, but it's the next major thing in prophecy that'll be coming upon mankind. But we gave you a couple stories related to the Red Horse War, and that includes civil war and the strife that's going on in the Middle East between Israel and the Arabs, the Palestinians, and then we're going to break and come back to some more stories related to the Red Horse in just a moment. We're going to cover a story next related to that first seal of Revelation, that white horse that Jesus Christ said was a deceiver. He said, don't let anybody deceive you. Many will come in my name, and saying that I'm Christ, and yet they'll deceive many. And even God inspired John to write in Revelation 12, verse 9, that the God of this world deceives the whole world. And having mentioned that, before we go to this story, let me just read that real quickly to you, friends, and get it word for word as God says it through John in the 12th chapter of Revelation, verse 9, where he says, and many of you know this, but some of you watching may not, and you may be surprised at what this verse says. And the great dragon, verse 9, Revelation 12, the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent. That dragon is an old serpent called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. Now it says right here, the devil and Satan deceives the whole world. Now some of you are going to kind of let that go over your head, and you're going to say, oh yeah, well there are a few deceived people in the world. No, excuse me. If you take it literally, like it says right here, friends, the devil and Satan deceives the whole world. He's got a religion that this world thinks many millions in the world, a little over 1 billion in the world, believe that this religion of Satan is of God. And God tells us in 2 Corinthians 4 and verse 10, I believe it is. Let's go over there for a moment. And let me make sure I'm telling you that right, and then we'll move on into our next video. 2 Corinthians 10, verse 4. All right, I got that backwards. Let's go to 2 Corinthians 4 and verse 10. Let's try it that way. You know, I'm looking for the verse, and we're going to take out a moment and just give me one moment. We'll pull that up. I've got a Bible online. I'm switching. Friends, I use 4 computers to run this program. And for those of you who tune in live, I apologize. We were several minutes late tonight. I had 2 computers. I used 4 computers to run this show, and 2 of them malfunctioned at broadcast time. I'm saving my money little by little to get backups for everything we use, so that if something goes wrong, I already have another backup already on and can just switch over to it real quickly. And we'll get there. Right now, the program is still small, but it's growing little by little, and as it grows, I add equipment to it that helps us do it a little better and that gives us backup. At least I've got that on the slate. Things to do is get some backup equipment. Now I'm looking for a verse that says angel of light. That should pop it up for us. 2 Corinthians 11. That's where we wanted to go. 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 14. All right, I got close, friends. I got 2 Corinthians 10. I just needed to go over one more chapter. And verse 14, where it says, and no marvel. Let's back up to verse 13 real quick, as long as we're on this, and then we'll go to video. For such are false apostles, deceitful workers. Now see Christ in Matthew and in Mark and in Luke. Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21 had been warning his disciples in answer to their question that one of the things that would happen before his return, there would be many deceivers. And as Revelation 12:9 says, Satan deceives the whole world. That means the majority of mankind, a vast majority, in order to call it the whole world. There's only a handful, only a few, a comparative few, who God has called now for a spring harvest, people who have to overcome Satan, which is not an easy battle. It's like going to a gymnasium to work out with weights, and the schedule for you is to ever increase your weights and really grow some muscle. And comparatively, parallel to that spiritually, God wants us to develop character, spiritual character. And he gives us some weights to lift. Now, we don't have to go in all at once and lift everything, but you better be there every day doing your workout and the muscles growing, so when the trials get harder and harder and the weights that you're supposed to lift is more, you'll have built up to be able to handle it. But related to all that, God says through Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 14, starting in verse 13, For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into the apostles of Christ. Now, he just before that said they are false apostles. So when he then says transforming themselves into the apostles of Christ, that means they're faking it and they're not real apostles. He's just said they are false apostles, but they claim to be God's apostles. But they're not really. They're false apostles. Oh, but they put on an awful good show. You should see the way they sprinkle that smoke around those altars and all those statues and things they have set up that look very religious, that are not the statue of Peter that people are led to believe, so they kiss the thing's toe, and if they really realized who that statue had been dedicated to, they'd be doing anything but kissing that statue's toe. And no marvel, verse 14, for Satan himself, he doesn't appear, this verse is going to tell us he doesn't appear as a devil in a red cape with a big, long, pointed tail. Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. Satan comes across appearing like a sheep, but he's not a real sheep. Inside is a wolf. He's just got sheep's clothing covering him. You know, he really is that thing dressed in a red cape with a long red tail. But he doesn't appear that way. He covers all that up with sheepskin and comes to you as if he were an angel of light. And he's set up a great religious system in this world. Now, and that great system, here is what it's doing in the news today. And let's just be very blunt with it, friends, because that very system is going to put a lot of us on either the guillotine or a stake of fire, torture us first in some way if we will not bow down and worship the image of the beast, and also if we refuse to work on the Sabbath and honor what they call the Lord's Day, which is really the day of Baal, the sun god. Pope Francis has begged forgiveness from the victims of sexual abuse by priests at his first meeting with the victims since his election. He met 6 victims, 2 each from Ireland, Britain, and Germany, after a private morning mass in the Vatican. Alan Johnston has this report in today's news.
They came here to the heart of the Catholic world. 6 victims of sex abuse by priests, invited to tell the Pope himself of the suffering they'd endured. Vatican television didn't put the group on camera, but it showed the Pope delivering his message to them.
With humility I beg for your forgiveness. I ask for your forgiveness for the sins of omission by the leaders of the Church that have not answered adequately for the allegations of abuse from the family members and by those that were the victims of abuse. This brings an additional pain to the abused victims and endangered other children who were at risk. There is no place in the Church's ministry for those who commit these abuses.
Later, the Pope met each of the victims in private. None of them appeared at a news conference afterwards, but a Vatican spokesman said that they'd been moved by their encounter with Francis.
I was able to see them naturally when they came out, not during the meeting, and I can testify to the deep gratitude and naturally emotion of these people to have had the possibility to have a meeting that was so deep and wide-ranging with the Holy Father.
The Vatican may well be right. The group that met Francis might indeed have been touched by his heartfelt appeal for forgiveness. But one of the major international organizations representing abuse victims said the Pope would be judged not by his words, but by his actions. It said he should now make public documents in the Vatican archives relating to the sex abuse scandal and punish those senior clerics who tried to cover it up. Alan Johnston, BBC News, at the Vatican.
And friends, in the few minutes we have remaining for a 1 hour report tonight, next from Germany. Germany arrests man suspected of spying for the United States. The alleged spy is believed to be an employee of the German Foreign Intelligence Service, BND, an employee of Germany's intelligence service. He's been arrested on suspicion of spying for the United States, according to the report. The man is said to have been trying to gather details about a German parliamentary committee that is investigating claims of U.S. espionage. German authorities have asked the United States ambassador for swift clarification. Now, friends, isn't that something? Germany, who gave an unconditional surrender to the Allies, to the United States, to the UK, to Russia, and to France at the end of World War II in 1945. Now, what has transpired that releases Germany from this unconditional surrender? Now, the United States is so soft, and under the Marshall Plan, the United States provided money to help rebuild Germany. My dad, who was fought in the European theater, was stationed in Germany after the war. He was over in Europe and fighting in Germany, and was a paratrooper and a assistant bazooka, the assistant to a bazooka man. And after the war, he was stationed in a city in Germany as military police, and he shared his rations of food with a German family until he was sent back to the United States, because after the war, Germany was just devastated. And the United States helped Germany rebuild with its Marshall Plan. The United States was opposed to how Russia came in and built that wall, and finally in around 1980, under President Reagan, that wall was torn down. Now, one of the men who was a Russian leader and then became the president of Poland, who just died, by the way, at age 86, and that's going to open up something interesting, because whoever becomes the leader of Poland now, it may be a transitional situation where Russia will be able to run back in there and grab off Poland again, just like it ran in and grabbed off a part of Ukraine and annexed it when the opportunity arose. But the United States was opposed to Russia setting up a wall, and oh boy, wanted to help reunify Germany. Well, friends, Germany should have been kept under its thumb the way they did, but God has otherwise in mind. God is going to use Germany. He says he will use the Assyrians, and modern-day Germany are the old Assyrians, all the way back to the times of ancient Israel. God says he will use the Assyrians to punish his people, the offspring of Israel, through whom God gave great promises through Abraham, Isaac, not Ishmael, but Isaac, and Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, who had 12 sons, one of whom was Joseph, who had 2 sons who took Joseph's name. Ephraim and Manasseh take the name of Joseph. They are as if they were one of the 12 sons of Israel. So they're part of the 12 tribes, but in essence, they're half-tribes. And the tribe of Manasseh, one of those half-tribes of their father Joseph, represents the United States today. And the other one, it is modern United States today. That's the bulk of the people. And Ephraim, the bulk of Ephraim now is the United Kingdom. The other son of Joseph, who takes Joseph's name. We're going to have to go over an hour, just a little bit. I got to give you this news, friends. The U.S. National Security Agency, NSA, was last year accused of bugging the phone of Chancellor Angela Merkel as part of a huge surveillance program. Now, and the Germans are using that fact to get themselves positioned ahead of the United States, no longer submissive as an enemy who signed an unconditional surrender agreement. Oh no, now the tables are flipped. And now this old enemy of the United States is positioning itself on top and angry at the United States for spying on it. Well, when you have done things as atrocious as Germany did in World War II and World War I also against the United States and signed an unconditional surrender, the United States should have a right to be spying on you today to make sure you're not going to repeat the same thing. However, friends, it's all part of what God says. It goes back to Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28. I mean, you know, we can banter this thing around all day, but when you understand the Bible, if we were obeying God, God would have us be the head and not the tail. And he'd have us be the lender, not the borrower. And it should be very obvious we are a huge borrower, not the lender. We're becoming the tail. We're being flipped on our head. We're becoming the tail, not the head. And even our old enemy, Germany, who signed an unconditional surrender after God helped the United States win, along with its other allies, win the war against Germany and the Nazis, who wanted to rule the world. God says when you don't obey him, you'll become the tail, not the head, and ultimately, if you continue to refuse to obey, he will bust the pride of your power. You'll just take the pride of your power away, as again, verse 19 of Leviticus 26 says, and the pride of our power is going poof. Here our old enemy Germany, rising up above the United States now and angry with the United States and going over and buddying with China. And making deals, and they're going to bypass using the dollar. They're going to get the euro further in line so that it can become a powerful monetary union for a revived Holy Roman Empire that will be comprised of 10 nations or regions, 5 from the east, 5 from the west, that will give their power to the beast, what the Bible calls a beast, but it's going to be modern Germany, who will be their leader at the time. Whoever it will be very likely crowned where all the old emperors of the Holy Roman Empire were crowned, whether they be German or French. They were crowned by the Pope in Frankfurt, Germany, in that Emperor's Hall, which was blown up at the end of World War II, but then the good old United States, through the Marshall Plan, helped rebuild the Emperor's Hall in Frankfurt, Germany, according to the old specifications, but with more modern building construction. And all the statues were put back in there of all the old emperors' statues and portraits. And that building is sitting there ready for the Pope to come over and put the crown on the head of a new emperor, the final head, the 7th head of the final revision of the Holy Roman Empire, who will then start World War III, will start the greatest martyrdom mankind has ever in his life seen. And friends, I hope some of you who have heard this for years will not just, I know that, la-di-da. I hope you will see that this is being made ready to happen any moment now. This could be happening very, very soon. I'm not saying it will, but I'm saying it could very well happen this year. Yes, God has delayed things, but you got to ask and answer the reason why. Why has he delayed things? And it may well be, as I've said a number of times here, because of us, you and me, who were asleep. And God wants us to be awake. Now, this spy accusation against the United States by Germany, the scale of the agency's global spy program was revealed in the documents that were leaked last year by a former intelligence contractor, Edward Snowden. The revelations about the NSA put a strain on ties between Germany and the U.S. But again, the reason for that is because the people of the United States, friends, we are not obeying our Creator. And so God allowed this strain on the ties between Germany and the U.S. to come about, and it raised feelings in Germany against American surveillance. Now, the BBC's Stephen Evans in Berlin in today's news says the new allegation of American spying on an ally may make it harder for the United States to get German help in its efforts to oppose Russian activity in the Ukraine and also to control Iranian nuclear ambitions. You see the pride of our power going right there in today's news. Boom, there's another slap in the face against the pride of the power of the United States. German media say the man arrested this week. I'm reading to you from an article related to today's news story, friends. German media say the man arrested this week is a 31-year-old employee of the federal service, the BND, or in other words, that stands for the German word Bundesnachricht. And there's another part of that word. I can't say it all. German words sometimes are long, super fragile, capitalistic, long words. But BND for short. The German Federal Prosecutor's Office confirmed the man's arrest but gave no other details. A spokesman for Miss Merkel, I'm sorry, Angela, said she had been informed of the arrest, as had the members of the 9-strong parliamentary committee investigating the activities of foreign intelligence agencies in Germany. The matter is serious, it is clear, spokesman Stefan Seibert told the Frankfurter newspaper, a newspaper in Frankfurt, Germany. Der Spiegel News magazine said the man was believed to have passed secret documents to a U.S. contact in exchange for money. However, one unnamed politician told Reuters news agency the suspect had offered his services to the United States voluntarily. The revelations about the NSA put a strain on ties between Germany and the United States and raised feelings in Germany against American surveillance. The BBC's Steve Evans in Berlin says the new allegation of American spying on an ally may make it harder for the U.S. to get German help, as I mentioned a moment ago, against the Russian activity in Ukraine and also to control Iranian nuclear ambitions. German media, well, let's see. Friends, I must have put this in my notes twice. I've got another picture related to this story. Actually, I've got a video. Let me zoom my notes ahead and tell you what this video is about. I know we're going a little extra over tonight, but friends, we got to wake up. We need to be awake. We need to invest some time. I spent all day working on these stories to pack them down for you, and then all you got to do is just sit here and watch. Grab yourself a nice lemonade, some good cola drink, something healthy for you, and a little bite to eat. If you're watching from the archive, you can put it on pause, come back and watch the rest of this. Let me just tell you where we're going with this next video, or I could just hit the button and go potluck with it. Here we go. United States to work with Germany on spy row. Let's just go potluck, friends. Here's our next video related to Germany and the spying allegation thing. Okay, I'm trying to roll the video. Please stand by. All right, friends, our video seems to be hung up. Here's what Mrs. Merkel said today. She said earlier today, while at a news conference with the Chinese premier she's visiting in Beijing, she said it is the second day of her 3-day visit, which is dominated by trade issues. The latest twist. Let's go for that. See if we got a picture. I had a picture of her standing next to the premier. The latest twist in the ongoing spying row, between the two countries happened last week when that German employee of BND was arrested. Again, the man is suspected of having handed over more than 200 documents over a 2-year period in exchange for 25,000 euros, 20,000 pounds, or the equivalent of $34,000. Questioned by reporters earlier today, White House spokesman Josh Earnest praised the valuable relationship between that the United States had with Germany and said, "We are going to work with the Germans to resolve this situation appropriately." You know, friends, once a bell is rung, the United States is going to have to work hard to bail itself out after losing the pride of its power in a situation where you've got an enemy that doesn't like being held down. And as soon as you get in a situation where you're now embarrassed, ooh, boy, that enemy can rise up over you and forget it. They're not going to humble themselves before us again unless we start obeying our Creator and God puts the pride back in our power. In an analysis by Stephen Evans, friends, I'm going to have to give you this and go for a quick story or two and then wrap it up. Spying is particularly sensitive in Germany, whether it's listening in to Chancellor Merkel's phone or reading secret documents meant for a parliamentary committee. Mrs. Merkel grew up in East Germany, where the intrusions of the secret police, the Stasi, were pervasive and poisonous. And democracy has something of a sacred quality in Germany today because of the Nazi and then the communist years. Outrage runs across the political spectrum. It's not just a chattering class issue. Wolfgang Bosbeck, for example, who is the Christian Democrat center-right head of the Bundestag Committee, which oversees interior affairs, questioned whether the United States and Germany could be considered as partners anymore. The first allegation of spying came just after President Obama's visit to Berlin, where he was greeted as a long-lost friend. And this latest one concerns material for the very parliamentary committee set up to investigate the previous allegation. Spies spy, and no doubt spies spy on friends, but there are political consequences when they are caught at it, even if it's just in terms of a loss of goodwill. And that's the end of Stephen Evans' analysis. All right, friends, let me give you this, because news is rolling by. If I don't go ahead and give you this tonight, by tomorrow, things will have moved into something else. And just stay with us a few more minutes and be up to date on everything today. Ukraine captures 2 more cities from separated rebels. I'll be back in a moment. Here's this story in video.
He's best remembered in the Western country. This is a paradox, but he's more popular in the West than in the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union republics. And even probably in his native Georgia, he was more a controversial figure. Whereas in the West here, he's remembered as this groundbreaking foreign minister of the Soviet Union, the man who helped to bring down the Berlin Wall.
In what way? Do we know much about, tell us more about how that happened?
Well, he was appointed as a foreign minister after Mr. Gromyko, who was known as Mr. No, this, poker face Soviet apparatchik.
Now, friends, let me break into this for just a moment and explain to you what he's talking about here so you can grasp what's going on. Georgian ex-president Eduard Shevardnadze died. He was 86 years old. His aide, Marina Davitashvili, said he had died today after a long illness. In 1992, he became the head of state of Georgia after it broke away from the Soviet Union. He led the country out of instability and civil war, but in November 2003 was toppled in the Rose Revolution sparked by opposition allegations of irregularities in parliamentary polls. Pavel Bendikov from the BBC's Russian service is here looking back at his life. Let's go back and roll the rest of this.
Who ran the Soviet foreign policy for decades. And Mr. Shevardnadze was this new bread brought by Mr. Gorbachev. And he was this not a career diplomat, which was shocking news for the Soviet system. And of course, for several years in this post of the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, he started to smile to the Western partners. And he coined the phrase partner. Before that, Soviet Union considered the West to be the opponent. He was the first who started to treat Western diplomats as partners.
And then he was elected president of Georgia, the country's second president. Started off with, high approval ratings, 70% of the vote, but allegations of corruption soon started to dog him, and then he ended up being toppled by a bloodless revolution.
Well, it was very interesting choice of Mr. Shevardnadze, because as a foreign minister of Soviet Union, he could enjoy this peaceful life wherever in the world, in Switzerland, in Moscow. He was famous and popular, but he chose to return to his native Georgia, chose to run for the president twice, and unfortunately for him, he ended up to be toppled by the protesters in the so-called Rose Revolution. And he spent his last days very quiet, and probably he felt sorry for his compatriots, he felt sorry for his former colleagues, he felt sorry for Mr. Gorbachev and his relation, but that's what happened to him. And of course he's a very famous politician who changed a lot in Eastern Europe and in Europe as such.
Friends, to end our program tonight, and listen, this is one of the exceptional times. Sometimes I've stretched the program from a half hour to 45 minutes, sometimes several times to a full hour. Tonight looks like we're going to go 90 minutes. The last story I'm covering tonight, friends, I hope you'll stay with this if you want to know and understand what to expect out of Egypt. If you take a look in your Bible, now, when we change that slide, I got to get somebody to fix this for me. Sometimes it cuts off my mic for a half a second, so I back up and repeat myself in case it's cut out my words. Isaiah 19 relates to our next story of Egypt. It starts out in Isaiah 19 by saying, the burden of Egypt. And it tells you how and why the rest of this chapter, parts of it may have happened in history before, but only in a small way, in a type. It was just a former shadow fulfillment for the full fulfillment in the latter day. And I'll tell you why. I'll say the words in a moment. Behold, the eternal, the Lord, rides upon a swift cloud, and shall come into Egypt, and the idols of Egypt shall be moved at his presence, and the heart of Egypt shall melt in the midst of it. Verse 2, and I will set the Egyptians against the Egyptians. And friends, you've been seeing that happen in the news related to Egypt in the past several months, couple of years. And they, the Egyptians, shall fight everyone against his brother, and everyone against his neighbor, city against city, and kingdom against kingdom. And what does that mean? Kingdom against kingdom. Egypt, a kingdom, other kingdoms, or kingdoms within Egypt, and it seems to be there are major divisions within Egypt that you could maybe say are separate kingdoms. And verse 3, the spirit of Egypt shall fail in the midst thereof, and I will destroy the counsel thereof, and they shall seek to the idols, and to the charmers, and to them that have familiar spirits, and to the wizards. And that should, some of you who've been in the church I've been part of for some time, that should have a lot of meaning to you. And verse 4, notice this one, and the Egyptians will I give over into the hand of a cruel Lord, and a fierce king shall rule over them, says the Lord, the Eternal of hosts. And it goes on to tell you some things that'll happen to Egypt, and Egypt that was portrayed as the king of the south of old is prophesied in those same terms, which the king of the south will be more than just Egypt in the future. It'll be the whole Arab world. and the king of the north is going to come in and invade, and so that cruel lord that will come into Egypt, take it over, and also that'll lend itself to the king of the north coming into Israel and taking command of it. But at that time, they may try to give the appearance, because of events that happen that will wipe away much of Israel, the king of the north may come in pretending to provide protection to the longtime residents, the remnant residents of Israel, the Jewish people who are still there. They may come in pretending to want to give protection to the Jewish people remaining in Israel, so they're going to take over and protect them from their big enemy, and they're going to play the game in between everybody, and they'll take over Egypt. And just watch to see how this plays out. I'll explain more as it begins to happen, as long as God leaves us here with the open door to be able to go over these things with you and share them with you. But here's what's happening in today's story, friends. Let me switch this back to our slide. The journalists that were hostage in a political battle between Egypt and Qatar, Peter Gresti, Mohammed Fahmy, and Baker Mohammed, who were sentenced to between 7 and 10 years in jail after being found guilty of aiding a terrorist group they were found guilty by the Egyptian court. Now here's what Mr. Sisi said. I'm sorry, Mr. Sisi. Here's what Mr. Sisi, by no means is he a sissy, having been the head of the Egyptian army, military that acted in such a strong way against many of the opposing Egyptians. Mr. Sisi was quoted by a newspaper late yesterday as saying, a Middle Eastern newspaper, I believe this was an Egyptian newspaper, I don't recognize it, by al-Masri al-Yum. He was quoted in that newspaper late yesterday as saying the trial had quote, very negative effects. His remarks, Sisi's remarks, received a mixed response from the journalist families, foreign government media. I want you to know what is happening in Egypt and with their new leader, and just have a little bit of an understanding, friends, from this important story in today's news about how and why things will shape the way they will in Egypt from henceforward. Foreign governments, media, let me give that a pause. Foreign governments, media organizations, and human rights groups, those three, accused the Egyptian authorities of restricting freedom of speech. Al-Jazeera said it defied logic, sense, and any semblance of justice. At a meeting with local journalists yesterday, Egyptian President Sisi sought to counter claims that the case had been politically motivated. The verdict issued against a number of journalists had very negative effects, and we had nothing to do with it, Sisi said, according to the al-Masri al-Yom newspaper. Quoting him further, the newspaper said that Mr. Sisi said, "I wished the journalists, were deported immediately after they were arrested instead of being put on trial." Now, friends, you know, the man who was the head of the Egyptian army is showing a waffling, wishy-washy, weak hand by saying, you know, initially he refused to interfere in the case, and he made that point blank. If he's really a strong man and a strong president, he could even now say, look, as the president who was the former head of the Egyptian military that took a strong hand, I am pardoning these guys. He could do that, but he hasn't. He refuses to interfere in the case. So he wishes they'd if what he's saying is true, if he really wishes they had not been sentenced, and he'd like to see them not in jail, do you not, President Sisi, as the former military head, really have the power? You could, by your word, say, I'm overruling that court, these men are pardoned. Duh? I mean, come on. Mohammed Abdul Hadi Alam, the editor of the state-run Al-Aram newspaper, and Imad Hussein, the editor of the private daily Al-Shuruk, confirmed to the BBC that the quotes that we just read to you from the newspaper were accurate. The president's initial reaction was to distance himself from the case and insist he would not interfere with the judiciary. His latest remarks will therefore raise hopes that he might yet issue pardons to set the journalist free, reports the BBC's Sally Nabil in Cairo. However, under Egyptian law, this can only happen after the appeals process has ended, which could take months, the BBC correspondent adds. Gresty, an Australian former BBC correspondent, Fahmy, a Canadian Egyptian who was Al-Jazeera English's Cairo bureau chief, and Mohammed, and we're going in reverse order, an Egyptian producer, were arrested in December. They were accused of aiding the Muslim Brotherhood following the military's overthrow of President Mohamed Morsi by providing it with media platform and equipment. The Egyptians were also accused of belonging to the outlawed Islamist movement. Just a couple more comments, friends, and we'll wrap up for tonight. But this sums up what's happening in Egypt with this important situation that is represents a grave violation of the freedom of press for countries that claim to be democratic. The journalist, you see pictured here, dismissed the trial as a sham, complaining that they were hostages in a political battle between Egypt and Qatar, which owns Al Jazeera and supports the Brotherhood. However, they were found guilty on June 23. Cresty and Fahmy were sentenced to 7 years in prison, while Mohammed received an additional 3 years for a separate weapons possession charge. 4 media students were also handed 7-year prison terms, and 3 other foreign journalists were sentenced to 10 years in absentia. And friends, let me see. Let me take just a quick look at our chart here, see how close we are. I got what we're going to need to wrap up. I'll show you this tomorrow night. We were a little bit cooler in Alabama tonight, and perhaps today, and perhaps that may be because of my neighbor, who runs this huge outdoor fan. And I ran out with my smartphone and grabbed a little video of that to show you his outdoor huge. This is a big fan. He just leaves it on all day long, and it puts out quite a bit of wind. In fact, if you can see his swimming pool behind it, they use it to cool people off when they're sitting around the swimming pool over there in his yard. Anyway, I thought just for fun I'd show you that, end on something light in the news from today. Friends, thank you for joining me. That's the end of our long 90-minute report for tonight, Monday night. God willing, and the creek don't rise, we'll be back here again tomorrow, Tuesday night, with the day's current news related to very significant things happening in the world today related to the Bible and prophecy here on Nightcast. Until next time, this is your host, enjoying that wonderful outdoor fan, saying good night, friends.
You have been watching Nightcast with Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth. Nightcast can be seen Sunday through Thursday nights here on cogtv.org. Tonight's program is also available anytime on demand in the cogtv.org video archive.